The whole idea of rehearsal frames, which started out not as a way to prescribe to people how to teach, but how to look at their own teaching, started because in watching my students watch themselves teach and watching experts teach, I realized that there were too many things for them to look at one time. Now that's nothing new. I mean, that wasn't some great discovery that I made, and lots of people don't understand that. But typically, when people are looking at something very complicated or thinking about something very complicated, often the way people try to accommodate a novice or even an intermediate level learner is to simplify the complicated thing in some way. But of course, you immediately recognize there are a lot of ways to simplify something. I mean, you can slice it, this way, or take little chunks of it out. And typically in teaching, not just in music teaching, but in teaching in general, the way we've simplified complex interactions in teaching is by looking at the nameable components of teaching. So someone say, well, let's just look at the instructions that teachers give, or let's just look at the modeling that teachers give, or let's just look at the feedback that teachers give. Or likewise, looking at different aspects of what the students do, how they play, whether they ask questions, whether their attention is focused, those kind of things. The problem with that kind of slicing up something complicated is that you immediately, when you start slicing, lose what clearly is the most important thing, and that's the interactivity of all those components, which you don't see when you're looking at only one component at a time. And ever since the 50s, when behavioral observation was all the sexy thing to do in education, that's what we were doing. We were slicing up everything and looking at parts of teaching and talking about those individual parts separate from one another. But again, what that lost, even though it provided a way to collect very clean data, what it lost is a deeper understanding of the interactions that were taking place. And of course we know when it comes to teaching, it's the interactivity that's the deal. It's not just what the teacher's doing, it's not just what the student's doing, it's how those things relate to one another. And you really don't see that when you're just evaluating one component of teaching at a time. So I tried to think of different ways to make this experience more manageable to observe. And one of the things that I recognize, and every good teacher recognizes, is that in a given class or a rehearsal or a lesson, there are a lot of little things that get taught or get learned in a span of time, whether it's an hour or 30 minutes or however long the interaction is. So the lessons are typically not about one thing. Rehearsals are not typically about one thing. Or classes are not typically about one thing. There are a lot of little things that they're about. And if a teacher is paying attention to students, which you would expect to happen most likely in a one-to-one lesson and perhaps a little bit less in a rehearsal and maybe even less in a class. But if a teacher's doing her job and people are really paying attention to what's going on, the teacher's basis for what she's doing one moment to the next is primarily going to be based on what the students are showing her in terms of what they're understanding and what they're able to do to demonstrate that they understand and are developing the skills that the teacher's trying to convey. So my motivation in doing this was to try to find out what's the smallest unit of a teaching and learning interaction. I mean, what can you say is a unit of teaching and learning that has all of the interactive components that one can see in teaching? So it has instructions, it has feedback, it has modeling, it has student behavior, it has students asking questions. I mean, all those kind of things are potentially in a unit. So rather than dividing longer teaching episodes into intervals of time that were pretty much arbitrarily determined, which is what a lot of behavioral observation did, what I started doing was allowing the focus of attention for the teacher and the learner to be the decision criterion for where you divide the lesson into parts, right? So if you watch somebody teach, or you watch a great conductor do a rehearsal, or you watch even a classroom teacher, teach a class very well, you'll see that throughout the course of instruction, there are different focuses of attention. Some of them predetermined by the teacher, some of them are reacting to what she observes in the students. I mean, it varies from time to time, right? And what's useful for observers who are learning to look at teaching in a more sophisticated way and not just either observing what teachers do and then trying to imitate that, but trying to really understand the relationship between what teachers are doing and what students are doing. It's useful for them to be able to look at something that's short enough and small enough that you can really notice change happening in a learner. And that's what rehearsal frames, now called teaching segments, do, is they allow a narrower focus of attention on the part of an observer that narrows down what could be a very long teaching and learning episode to a relatively small segment that's focused on one particular target. Typically, when I observe really superb teachers teaching skills, like music skills, rehearsal frames generally last between 90 seconds and 4 minutes. They seldom go longer than 4 minutes. And there's a reason for that. Because excellent teachers understand that what generates motivation in the part of the learner is recognizing their own accomplishment. So you have to ask the question, once you identify a target goal for a learner, how long can you ask a learner to pursue that goal without accomplishing it, right? And the reason expert teachers' rehearsal frames tend to be relatively brief is that they are strategically selecting targets, right, that are accomplishing in that span of time. Right? If somebody says, well, I watched this rehearsal frame myself and it was 30 minutes long, I'm thinking, well, first of all, either you're misunderstanding what I mean by a rehearsal frame, or you're killing your student because nothing's being accomplished and you're banging through the same thing over and over again. That's not strategic, effective teaching. That's just sort of labeling goals and then banging through them without accomplishment. So the nature of this, the impetus for this, my motivation for this, was to provide an observation window for novices to see the guts of teaching, to see really how a teacher goes about making change happen in a learner. Now, of course, I say that in quotes, because of course no one makes change happen in a learner. You set up situations so the learner recognizes differences between what they're actually doing and what you're intending for them to do, and now what they're intending for themselves to do, and trying to resolve that discrepancy is where learning happens, right? But typically that's going to happen many, many times in even a 30-minute lesson, right? There are going to be a lot of little things that happen. And I find a good way to start students getting hip to this idea of rehearsal frames or teaching segments or whatever anybody wants to call them is by first asking somebody to look at their teaching or someone else's teaching and to just identify all of the targets that go by. Don't try to think about how they're accomplished. Don't think, just all the things that a teacher says, that's a goal, that's a goal, that's a goal. Now the goal might be something that's accomplishable in 10 seconds, right? It might just be sit up, that might be the goal. And in fact, many students, if told to sit up, can sit right up and that goal is now accomplished. But the most important thing about rehearsal frames isn't the stuff I've said so far. The most important thing about rehearsal frames is what happens at the end of a rehearsal frame. When it's time for the teacher to either move on because they can't accomplish what they set out to accomplish and they're going to cut their losses and move on to something else, or they've in fact elicited a change in behavior from the learner and now they're able to move on to something else. Because if you watch novice teachers and really superb teachers work over a period of time, you'll see that many of them identify exactly the same targets. They hear what's wrong, they say things that are wrong. But what differentiates novices from experts is the extent to which an expert will stay with a given target until it's very clear that the behavior change is going to stay that way after the rehearsal frame is over. What novices do when they identify a target, even a target that would be identified by an expert, identify the target, ask the student to play, the student plays, it might get better, maybe it even won't, and the novice moves on. What an expert does typically is very tenacious about making sure that whatever the target is accomplished, not only accomplished, but accomplished with enough repetition that it's very likely that that's now going to stay that way, at least in the near term. So that end segment of the end of the segment, the end of the teaching segment, the end of a rehearsal frame, that point at which somebody has to decide, is it time to move on or not, that's really what separates really superb teachers from not so superb teachers. I mean, other stuff does too, but that's a big deal, right? Because what we see when we watch the rehearsal frames or entire lessons of really superb teachers, there is a tenacious allegiance to doing things well. So even if something is very, very small and seemingly not very consequential right now, to an expert, it is consequential because you're establishing habits, right? So an expert will insist upon, in a given rehearsal frame or teaching segment, that no, that has to be, you have to actually do that right. So when I say that the bow is going to move at this speed, by God, it's going to do that, right? And whereas a lot of teachers will say, well, it's late, that's close enough. Experts don't do that. And where that's visible is when you look at 90 seconds to 4 minutes of a rehearsal or a class or a lesson at a time. And that's the value of looking at things in terms of rehearsal frames or teaching segments or whatever you decide to call them.